The Hunter's Call. Prologue. The King of Bones. The old Belathon family castle had once been the crowning jewel of Corsair, an island off the coast of Alos, and once the trade hub between the kingdoms of Grecia and the isles of the Western Oceans. The castle had been known as the Gilded Fortress, due to its unbelievable strength and beauty. Now, it was a dark, desolate place. A place where screams could be heard echoing throughout the lower regions of the keep. Baron LaSalle, a short, lean man with brown hair, a small nose, and olive skin, clenched his eyes shut as the fervent screaming rushed into his ears. He sat crouched on the cold stone floor in a cell no taller than 4 feet, his hands pressed firmly to his ears, and his knees held up near his chin. It reminded him of a large coffin, but not so long as to stretch out completely. On one end was solid stone, and on the other, metal bars allowed him to see and hear everything going on in the room just outside. He sat as far away from those bars as he could possibly get. Yet at the moment, he paid no attention to the size of his prison, but rather to the screams of his comrade, Geril Enins. That was the worst part of it all, the screams. No matter how hard Farron tried, it was impossible to completely tune them out, due to the constant echoes bouncing off the stone walls and into his cell. Whenever he or one of the other 2 scouts was being questioned, not a second went by where their cries of anguish could not be heard. He could not help but feel an incredible pang of guilt in his heart as he heard his friend plead for the torture to end.
"I don't know nothing else. No, wait, stop. What are you doing?"
cried Geril's deep, baritone voice, a slight quiver creeping into his words. He was breathing hard, as if he had just been running.
"You said you'd stop if I told you what I wanted."
"Yes," replied an eerie, scratchy, and masculine voice. "But unfortunately for you, I find your companions to be much more participant subjects."
"What's that supposed to mean?"
demanded Geril, his voice regaining some confidence. The only answer he was given was that of a single burning torch nearing his body. Some odd minutes later, the faint sounds of a screeching rat began to permeate the dungeon.
Wait,
Geril pleaded worriedly.
"I know more. I can tell you more."
His voice had now lost the last bit of dignity it had had just a few minutes earlier. Geril was a hard man, a man able to withstand an exceeding amount of pain. But in the end, Farron had known he would break, just like himself. After a short while of pleading for them to stop, the screams of pain eventually began to fill the prison once more, except this time, they never ceased.
No, please stop. I can feel it. The teeth. Oh, gods, please stop.
Geril's baritone voice rose to a pitch Farron would have never thought possible from a man such as he. The sound caused the hairs on the back of his neck to stand on end, and his thoughts immediately shot back to when he was a boy on his first hunting trip with his father, where for the first time he had witnessed a deer being eaten alive by a pack of wolves. The cry of utter anguish that protruded from that beast's throat was as close to the sound of Geril's screams as he could think of, and the memory filled him with a sickening sense of doom that would have made him vomit if he hadn't been starved half to death. Farron had no idea how long the torture lasted, though he would have guessed a few hours, during which time he desperately tried to focus on anything other than the perverse acts at hand. Many times, he felt himself begin to cry, but the tears never flowed out. He just sat there, quivering and naked, as his cell was filled with Geril's screams. His thoughts hung on his own hours of torture during the past few weeks. He could not help but think about the burning torch on his skin, the needles digging beneath his fingernails, the time spent in his cramped cell, or the man's face. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see that face, and he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to unsee it. He shook his head violently in an attempt to rid the image from his mind's eye. Eventually, the cries of pain began to fade, until they finally vanished, casting an eerie silence within the chamber. For the first time in hours, Farron opened his eyes. All he saw was darkness, but soon his vision adjusted enough to be able to see the dim glow of the torch out of the corner of his eye. He contemplated on moving toward the cage door to peek out and see what was going on, but he changed his mind as soon as he heard a hoarse whisper speak out in an unknown language. He recognized it, however, as the language the torturer used to communicate with his servants. It was both eloquent and guttural at the same time, if that made any sense. Soon after the words had been uttered, Farron heard the shifting of metal boots on stone and the clinking of armor as someone moved across the dungeon. For a moment, his heart began to thump hard in his chest, and he instinctively shuffled even farther into the corner of his cell. The primal sense of fear that coursed through his veins like boiling water never left him. But he did relax a little once he realized the sound was moving in the opposite direction. He noticed the dim torchlight stayed where it was, just out of view. How odd is it that I now find consolence in the dark? He thought to himself. Now it is the light of the torch I fear. His thoughts were interrupted, though, when he heard the familiar voice of his other companion, Robin. His voice was different than Geralt's. Instead of a deep, commanding tone, Robin's was higher, and normally more cheerful. He was actually known throughout the military camp as being one of the best singers in the militia. Now, though, his voice was quiet and pleading, yet somehow resigned.
Please, I've told you everything you've asked.
His words were immediately followed by the creaking of the barred door swinging open.
Please, don't do this. No, no.
Farron could hear him being dragged out of his cell before he smacked hard against a stone floor a few feet below. It was followed by more dragging and pleading. There was another command from the torturer, mirrored by even more dragging and pleading, accompanied by the rattling of chains and shackles somewhere to the left.
Why do you not kill me?
Croaked Robin, his throat craggy from lack of water. The torturer gave no immediate response. For the first time since being dragged out, Robin must have laid eyes on Geralt, for he abruptly burst out in a fit of exhausted weeping. Farron was certain there were no tears in those sobs.
Kill me!
Robin suddenly screamed. It was immediately replaced by a fit of coughing. Normally, the torturer paid their cries of anguish no heed, but this time, Farron could hear him make his way over to where he had Robin chained up. The torchlight moved farther away, cloaking him in more of that soothing, calming darkness he had come to love. He did not hear the torturer's first words of response, and that intrigued him. So, even though he was filled with a crippling sense of fear, he forced himself to crawl to the edge of his stony coffin, where he would hopefully be able to better distinguish his words. It was the first time he had moved in hours, so his muscles and tendons were as tight as bowstrings. He tried not to put too much pressure on his left hand so to not hurt his index finger, the finger which had had its nail forcefully removed. Once at the bars, he dared to peer out upon the dungeon. It was a large, square room spanning about 30 feet from each opposite wall to the other. Despite the fact there was only one torch illuminating the room, he was still able to see the long wooden table in the center. Atop it were various torture tools coated in dry blood, and standing both in front and behind were two unmoving figures dressed in rusted gold armor. If he pressed his cheek against the iron bars, he was able to see the hunched back of the hooded man, torch held high in his left hand, illuminating Robin's skeletal face. Farron could see his comrade strapped upright in the corner by two chains connecting his wrists to the stone ceiling. Two more connected his ankles to the floor. As soon as his gaze fell upon Robin's bloody, sunken face and swollen eyes, he couldn't help but tear himself away from the sight. Instinctively, he looked for the exit, and although he could not see it, he knew that directly across from his cell, on the opposite side of the room, a stone staircase led up out of the chamber. But only despair filled him as his thoughts drifted toward the euphoric idea of escape. And so he forced his vision farther to the right. Without realizing it, his gaze fell upon the other wooden table, the one on the opposite side of the dungeon where Robin was now. And on that table, even though the torchlight was dim and casted long, wild shadows, he was still able to distinguish the carcass of Geralt, lying flat on the table, his arms and legs stretched wide with what appeared to be a birdcage upon his stomach. Farron gave himself no time to examine the corpse further than a quick glance. His fear overrode his curiosity, and he once again clamped his eyes shut in both defiance and acceptance of the scenery. He could feel his muscles tighten up and down his body as he began to quiver even more. "Do you not wish to be here? Do you not love me?" He heard the torturer purr gently. The words were so quiet he did not initially understand them. "Do you not wish to please me?" There was no immediate response. Farron forced himself to open his eyes once more. He peered through the bars and to his left, back toward Robin and the hunchbacked man. But he knew he wouldn't be able to handle seeing Robin in such a mangled, helpless mess. So instead, he focused his gaze on the torturer's deformed shoulder blades. That did not last long, however, once the torturer raised his right hand to caress Robin's cheek. "Why do you not look at me?" the voice continued to purr. "Am I that hideous?" Robin gave no reply. He simply kept his swollen eyes closed and his bloodied mouth clamped shut, forming a thin line across his lips. "I suppose I understand your fear. I do not appear as I once did." The torturer removed his hand from Robin's face, holding it in the air in front of himself. Although Farron could only see the back of the torturer's head, he could tell he was inspecting his own flesh. The torchlight flickered across the inky black skin, which stretched across his long, bony fingers, like moonlight on the surface of a dark lake. "Although I suppose I was never really a good-looking man to begin with." The torturer dropped his hand back down to his side, then fixed his attention back on Robin. "Please, just kill me," Robin managed to croak, his voice just above a whisper. His words hung in the air for a moment, the room so silent Farron swore he could hear a buzzing sound, like a distant swarm of flies hovering over a corpse. The torturer let out a disapproving sigh. "A shame." Without warning, the torturer turned away from Robin, his gaze momentarily crossing over Farron's form. Even though he could not see the man's face underneath the black hood, he could feel the torturer's eyes on him, like a lion spotting its prey. His heart froze in his chest as the figure slowly spun himself toward the center table instead, away from his cell. As soon as the man's attention was off him, he scuttled away from the iron-barred door as quickly and silently as possible, plastering himself against the opposing wall. Only then did he realize he had been holding his breath. As he let the air pour out through the thin crack in his lips, he became painfully aware of how loud his heart was beating. It thumped inside his chest like a war drum. He prayed the torturer would not hear it. As the man shuffled toward the center of the room, the torchlight too shifted across the dungeon, until it was directly in front of Farron's cell. The light from the yellow flames penetrated the coffin-like confinement, causing strips of shadow to flicker across his skin. Inside the light, he felt vulnerable, and painfully aware of his nakedness. He imagined this must be how a rabbit feels crossing an open field, terrified a hawk would come down and snatch it from off the ground. This time, he did not close his eyes, but he did keep them down, only allowing him to see outside movement through his peripheral vision. He tried his best to control his breathing and to calm his heart rate. For a few minutes, nothing happened. He could hear the torturer tinkering with some objects on the table for a little while, until eventually, the man made a command in the foreign tongue. Once again, Farron's heartbeat quickened as the sound of metal scraping on stone permeated the air, but steadied slightly as he heard the footsteps moving away from him. And this time, they went farther than usual, all the way up the stone steps and out of range. The armored servant was not gone for very long, however. Soon enough, he heard the footsteps slowly return and make their way back down into the chamber, where they proceeded to march to their master's side. A soft thump and a residual ring followed quickly after. Farron did not look up.
What are those for?"
Robin stammered. The torturer let out a chuckle that sounded more like the hissing of snakes than human laughter. "Ah, I see you are anxious to continue." His voice was full of mockery. "Do not worry. This is not for you." Farron's ears perked up at that. Not for you. Every fiber of his being wanted to lift his head to see what they were talking about, but he couldn't force himself to do it. All of a sudden, the torchlight was shifting again as he realized the man was moving his way across the dungeon, and once more, to his immediate relief, the man was moving away from him. There was then the soft sound of metal flicking on metal, accompanied by a high-pitched creak, the sound of hinges. He recognized it as a wooden chest being opened. There was some shuffling of objects, and soon after, a hollow thump. The torchlight creeped back toward the center of the room. His breath caught in his throat. "Idla riumli voalmi." Metal footsteps scraped across the stone floor toward his cell. No, he thought to himself. He clamped his eyes shut once more and wrapped his bony hands around the back of his neck, pulling his head down closer to his inner thighs. No, please, no, leave me alone. He could hear metal gauntlets handling the lock on the door. His heart beat so loudly it drowned out his own dismayed thoughts, but he stayed silent. The torturer did not like when they struggled. The lock clicked and the door swung open. A long, high-pitched screech pervaded the dungeon. He braced himself, awaiting the cold grasp of the armored servant as their fingers wrapped around his ankle and dragged him out. but nothing happened. After a moment, he dared to look up toward the figure standing just outside, a figure as unmoving as a fallen tree, covered in golden plate armor. Farron was unable to make out any facial expressions, though, due to the metal helmet atop his head, and the light that hit him from behind, which casted a shadow across the entire front half of his armor. "Not bis, ikoe," came the torturer's harsh command. The armored man shifted slowly to the side, allowing Farron a full view of the prison. His sight naturally drifted toward the torturer, still standing beside the wooden table, staring at him. He was glad the shadows of the man's hood still covered his face. The torturer lifted his free hand into the air, gesturing for Farron to come toward him. "Come," he said calmly. Farron did not move a muscle. "Come," he said again, his voice edged with venom. To Farron's own surprise, he felt himself moving. Carefully, he dragged himself feet first across the stone toward the opening. As soon as his toes felt open air, he stopped, giving the armored man a wary glance. Then, even though the voice in his head cried for him not to, he let the rest of himself slip out. As soon as his feet touched the stone floor, his knees buckled beneath him, and he felt himself falling. He threw his hands outward toward the barred door, which still hung open, and grasped onto the cold iron. Using his weight, he pulled himself back up into a standing position. He kept his eyes down. "Do not worry, Farron LaSalle," purred the torturer as he turned his attention away from the naked prisoner. "Come, drink." He then used his free hand to grip the handle of an eloquently designed silver pitcher. He raised it off the table and tipped it forward, allowing the clear water within to pour into a silver goblet. This could be a trap, Farron thought, but his body did not listen. Before he could stop himself, he frantically stumbled forward, almost falling to the ground, but catching himself on the edge of the table. He snatched the goblet in both hands as he slid to his knees. He shakily raised the metal to his lips and let the liquid drain into his mouth. Cool, fresh, life-giving water poured in so fast he was unable to contain it all, lines of it sliding down his cheeks like small rivers, before dripping onto his thighs. He shivered as the droplets hit his skin, but he did not care. He had never tasted anything so delicious. For a short while, he did not even care that the man was standing less than 3 feet away, his black robes almost brushing against him. He drained the goblet in seconds. Once gone, he immediately wanted more, but instead, he sheepishly placed the goblet back on the table, trying his best to avoid the torturer's gaze, which he knew was on him. The thirst within him was even worse now than just moments before, for the water only made him feel more parched. Farron could hear Auburn's groans a short distance away. He was probably thirsty. "Did you enjoy that?" the man inquired, his question obviously directed to Farron. Hesitantly, he nodded, though he still averted his eyes. "Good, good. And would you like more?" He was unsure how to answer that. Was this a trick? Was this a test? During the first week of his imprisonment, the man had asked him a multitude of questions. A few were of his home and childhood, while others were directed toward knowledge of Intar's forces on Corsair. Even after being here for weeks, he still did not know what the torturer wanted. He was the most unpredictable creature Farron had ever met. Instead of replying, he simply stayed in his current position, unmoving. His hand shook violently. Behind him, he could hear Robert let out another groan. "Answer me, love. Do not be frightened." Yes, Farron stammered. He didn't dare say anything else. He almost felt ashamed. "I know you do," the craggy voice stated. Farron felt the man's long fingers unexpectedly touch his scalp as he ran them through his greasy hair. It took all his willpower not to bolt to the other side of the room. "Stand," the man suddenly commanded, placing his hand back at his side, torch still in the other. Albeit quite straining on his quivering muscles, Farron stood without question. The torturer's voice once again changed to a soothing tone. "Do you wish to please me, Farron LaSalle?" He desperately tried to decipher the man's motives, but knew he only had so much time before the torturer would take offense. "If you don't answer soon, he'll string you up like he did Robert, and do only gods know what to you," a voice within him said. He knew the voice was right. "No more pain. No more." Yes, of course I do," he heard himself saying. The words sounded hollow to him. Yet the answer seemed to please the torturer, for he raised his hand once again and used the back of his inky black fingers to caress Farron's cheek, causing goosebumps to spread across his neck. Good. The torturer then removed his hand and thrust it out the other, the yellow flames burning only a few inches from Farron's nose. He jolted in surprise and leaned away from the torch, inadvertently looking up at the hooded figure, and for the first time in days, glimpsed his face. Fear spread through his entire body like wildfire. For a few moments, he could not tear himself away from the sight as his mouth twisted in horror. But luckily, he was able to gain his composure rather quickly and turned his gaze back toward the ground. He could feel the man regarding him as he tried to steady his wobbling knees. "Does he want me to take the torch?" Almost as if he could read Farron's mind, the man suddenly spoke. "Take it," he prompted, giving the torch a small jolt with his arm. As Farron clasped his own fingers around the wooden shaft, he made sure to avoid the man's gnarled fingers. Slowly, he pulled the torch free from his grasp. The torturer gave it up willingly. Farron took a cautious step back. The man turned to the table and snatched up a long, curved dagger. "Come," he commanded. Reluctantly, Farron followed the figure to where Robin was shackled. His feet felt unnaturally heavy as he walked, as if he had stones tied to his ankles. "What?" stammered Robin as they approached. "What are you going to do?" His eyes were swollen, but the fear within them was still clearly visible. As soon as they reached the corner of the dungeon, the torturer neared Robin and drew the dagger up toward him. "No, stop!" Robin gasped as the dagger's sharp edge slid across his bare chest, digging into his flesh. He groaned in pain. As the blade was dragged from his left breast to the right side of his navel, a thin scarlet line appeared on the skin. Drops of blood trickled down his torso like bloody tears. "Shaler, Marinora, any of the gods, have mercy on me." His plea came out as a frantic whisper. The torturer stepped back, attention still on Robin. "It seems to me," he said, "that your friend needs his wound to be cauterized. It would be a shame if it were to become infected." His words hung in the air, precise and insinuating. Farron did not miss the meaning. "Farron, please do—" Robin's words were cut off by the sudden searing of his own flesh. He cried in anguish as the flames licked against his body, fusing the skin back together. "The gods are not here," the man said, his voice sounding distant. "There is only me." Farron's hand shook violently as he forced the torch upon his friend's abdomen and worked his way upward. He had to steady the shaft with both hands to keep it from falling from his grasp. It seemed like an eternity had passed, but eventually the work was finished. Robin's form hung limp, his limbs bent in strange angles. He was unconscious. "What have I done? I've helped torture my own friend and comrade. I'm a traitor to my own people." A deafening silence permeated the chamber, but was almost immediately broken by the thunderous crack of the torturer's hand smacking hard against Robin's cheek, jolting him back to consciousness. "Farron, be a dear and fetch the poor man some water. He appears to be thirsty." Robin groaned and attempted to lift his drooping head, but it sank back down. Farron's legs felt weak and his stomach sick, but he hurried back to the center table and enclosed his fingers around the pitcher's handle, which was designed to look like a rose wrapping itself up a tree branch. As soon as he tried to lift it, however, the pitcher nearly slipped from his hand due to the intense trembling in his limbs. He set it back down on the table before placing the torch beside his feet. Next, using both hands, he raised the pitcher and poured the contents into the same goblet he had drank from earlier.
"What are you doing?"
demanded the voice inside his mind. This time, it sounded eerily similar to Garrel's.
"You're bending to this monster's will like a tight slave. Fight, damn you! You're part of the 10th cohort. Fight!"
"You are taking too long," came the torturer's voice, calmly echoing off the dungeon walls. He did not sound agitated, Farron noted, but he thought it best not to keep the man waiting. He set the pitcher back down in its place before bending to scoop the torch up off the floor. With a shaky hand, he grabbed the goblet and shuffled to the torturer's side, water spilling out the entire way. By the time he reached his friend and lifted the cup to his lips, half the water which had been inside was gone. Still, Robin guzzled the liquid down as fiercely as a newborn might drink from its mother's breast. Once the goblet was empty, Farron drew the cup away, then timidly moved back. His heart throbbed with guilt and pity. "He'll kill you if you do not do as he commands," he reminded himself. "Anyone would do the same in your place." Thank you, Farron, the man said, laying his hand on his bearer's shoulder. As soon as the man's hand touched his skin, Farron jumped back, dropping the goblet in surprise. The metal clanked hard against the stone, sending an empty reverberation all through the chamber. The sudden burst of sound made him flinch. He drew in a quick breath and held it, unable to move anything other than his bloodshot eyes. Nervously, he glanced at the two armored servants, but they stood silent, as usual. To his relief, the man seemed not to care. He ignored the incident as he bent forward near Roburn's torso, observing the skin where Farron had cauterized the wound. "You did fine work," the man commented. Farron did not respond, but instead kept his head down, his entire frame trembling in fear. After a few moments of silence, the man continued. "It is not polite to ignore a compliment."
Thank you,
Farron managed to stammer. A slight smirk appeared on the torturer's twisted face, although Farron was unable to see it. "Do not worry. There will be more opportunities to prove your gratitude."